slideshow. So let me start this learning outcome 2 with a bit of a slideshow that I want to show. And what we want to be able to do is basically use this slideshow to recognize the various forms of data. And then what we are going to do is when we do this, we are going to be looking at also reasoning that why this is the case or why this is not the case. Is that okay? So everybody's able to see this particular slide that I've opened up?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
Now, the activity that we are going to do to understand various forms of research and how it is carried out is to first identify whether the source of data is primary, secondary, or tertiary. And we will look at reasoning of why this is primary, secondary, or tertiary. So let's start. Now, the first part that I want to look at is I'll show you an image, which is this, which is a picture or a photograph, a photo frame, which is basically on the wall. Now, is this primary? Is this secondary? Is this tertiary? Any ideas? If you see a canvas or a picture on the wall, what will it be classified as? Will it be called a primary source, a secondary source, or a tertiary source? Are you able to see the slide?
Yeah,
Yes,
we're able.
yes.
I think we're just not sure what to answer.
All right. Okay. No, that's fine. There's no right and wrong answer. What we're trying to do is try and identify the sources of data. So the idea is there is no right and wrong answer. Let's participate and basically, understand whether this is primary, this is secondary, or this is tertiary. Now, the basic definitions, if I put it this way, let me just come out of the slideshow and let me also put this across in terms of, just to give you a bit of a basic definition in terms of what is primary source. So if I say primary source, or say secondary source or say tertiary, what does that mean? Now, when we look at, let's say something directly, that means we are seeing it firsthand. We are talking about it firsthand. We are collecting it firsthand. The information that you're going to be able to directly access firsthand is always going to be considered as what is called primary source. Is that clear? Is that
No.
okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, data that you get hold of. So examples of primary source could be articles, journals, it could be reviews that you're reading, it could be book that you're reading, it could also be that you're witnessing an accident. If, for example, you are in a particular location, you've gone to an event and you've gone to Taylor Swift's music concert and you're hearing her live on the concert, you are present physically there. And that is why it is a primary source, because you're in the event, you're in the moment, and you're essentially observing it firsthand. Now, what is secondary? Secondary source tends to be when you're looking at, getting hold of that information through somebody else, because the word itself, secondary, says you're going to get this from somebody who has witnessed the event. So if I had gone into the Taylor Swift, my daughter would have gone into the Taylor Swift music contest. When she came back from the concert, she explained to me, this is what I did. So I'm trying to imagine it and I'm trying to relive that moment, but I'm doing it through my daughter's description because I'm hearing it from the primary source, but I was not physically present there. And in those cases, that will tend to be what is called a secondary source. Is that okay? Now, secondary source could be textbooks, it could be articles, it could be edited pieces of work, it could be review or some sort of legislation, it could be biographies. Say, for example, Steve Jobs, who was the CEO of Apple or founder of Apple. When he died, somebody wrote a biography about him. So when you're reading the biography, the biographer who actually sat with Steve Jobs, did the interviews, got the information, did that firsthand. He was the primary source, but he's the one who has written the book. And in that case, when you're buying the book off the shelf, is a secondary source because you're reading the biography, which has been compiled and published by the author. Now, what is a tertiary source? Anybody, any idea what is a tertiary source?
That's the one.
So when I take tertiary, yeah, go on. A
Mm.
tertiary source is essentially a source which is a combination of primary and secondary to a large extent. It is something that is already in existence, and you or multiple people might be able to use that as a reference and then bring it into your work. So an example is when you do your assignments, you do referencing. So in those cases, when you pick up words, text, material, which is coming from books, articles, journals, which has already been published by a publisher, but written by the original author, he or she might not be alive today. In those cases, when you're picking that material up, but you're still citing a reference or giving credit to that person when you're using it in your own assignment, would be an example that you are actually using what is called the work that you're producing as an assignment is a tertiary source. It has information which has been compiled or gathered or gleaned from various sources, and this then tends to be a combination of primary and secondary, and that is why it will be called a tertiary source. A tertiary source example would be, you look at bibliographies, you look at databases of data which has been published, for example, by the government on COVID. Now that is something which is in the public domain, anybody can access it, and that data, when you access it through a database, is essentially going to be tertiary because somebody compiled the data, some department within the government or some people responsible actually published the data, and then you have gone about using that database to basically refer to that data again. Encyclopedias, when we talk about, or we talk about timelines or graphs which are showing information which is portraying information from the past, is all going to be an example of tertiary source. So tertiary source tends to be information which has already been published either as a primary source or a secondary source, and that is being used to either draw conclusions, interpretations, or used by third parties to be able to bring something across, in terms of their discussion. So these tend to be the three different definitions of, let's put it this way, different types of data: primary source, secondary, and tertiary. Now let's look at going into the slideshow. Is that okay?
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay, let's look at the first one, which is a canvas. Say, for example, you've gone to a music or an art gallery and you've watched this, you've looked at this canvas hanging on the wall. What is this? Is it a primary source, secondary source?
Primary.
Second.
Primary for me.
Primary. Now, the reason why this is primary is because it is showing, you are witnessing it firsthand. You've gone to a gallery, and assuming, the reason is the slideshow that we are doing is you're assuming that you are in that moment. You are looking at that as an assumption that you are there. And that is where you're watching it firsthand, and it will be primary. Let's look at the second one. Now, this is a cover of a book, which is the book published
Secondary.
by Melissa Muller, and it's a biography.
Secondary is because it's been already written by somebody who not just wrote,
Yes,
type it, make the book as well.
absolutely. So this is secondary. Good. The third one, this is like a classified advert, which was published in the newspaper.
Tertiary, maybe?
So when we look at,
Mm.
assuming this was a classified advert, which if you read it carefully, it says philosophical transactions account, and it says in many considerable parts of the world, volume, so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. Now, if this was it looks like to be a cover of a book or a classified advert, which has been photocopied from some place, and it is being shown to you, from that context. So in this case, if it's a cover of a book and it has been photocopied and I'm showing it to you firsthand, will it be primary, secondary, or tertiary?
Secondary.
Secondary, yes.
So if I repeat myself, when I say, if I'm showing a photocopy of a cover of a book or a classified advert and showing it to you firsthand, will it be primary?
It will be a primary, but if it's already photocopy,
So this would be primary if you are seeing it firsthand. It can also be secondary, because you're also right, it could also be secondary because this was published in 1665 and 1666. So I am looking at something in the past. it would have been present and primary if I was present and living in 1665, or something which was published in 1665 has been photocopied and is now being relived today. That is why it is primary. But if you are present in that time and you are watching it now, then it will become secondary. Now, this is an almanac. What is an almanac? Any idea? Anybody knows what is an almanac?
No, I'm not sure.
Okay, almanac is basically an annual calendar, with important dates, which is normally published. So for example, we are all approaching the new year, and what will happen is there are lots of calendars and other bits which will come across in the newspaper that you can use in your home, and there will be some inserts. So almanac is like an annual calendar. Now, is this primary, secondary, or tertiary?
Is it tertiary?
Absolutely correct. So this is tertiary because it says almanac for 1875. That means this calendar would have been published in 1875. And if I'm looking at it right now, it seems to be a copy or a good color, genuine copy, then it is tertiary because I'm not in that time. I'm basically picking it up from an archive or a library, and that is why it is tertiary. Why would it be secondary, or why would it not be secondary? Is because you are not in that time. Primary, if you were present in 1875, then it would have been primary. You would have picked it up firsthand and you would have used it, and that would have been primary. But from what I see, it is primarily tertiary today because it's a copy and it is not in present time. Is that okay?
Yes.
Now, let's go to another cover of a book. And this cover of a book basically is
Secondary.
something that you have picked up for reading.
Secondary.
Primary.
Okay. It does not have the word biography on it, for example, and it is a book that you picked up from library for reading.
Primary.
Primary, absolutely, yes. Because you're reading this book, you're picking it up, you're getting the book issue, and you're reading the book firsthand. You're not listening into the story of Anne Frank. You're actually reading this book, and that is why it is going to be primary. Now, this is an example of a chart which is showing, two moving lines. So assume you are in a stock exchange, or you're in a place or a market wherein there's a TV monitor which is displaying this graph in real time, right? Like the pound to the, say, for example, dollar value, or pound to the euro value going up and down, and it is showing it in live, circumstances. Whether it will be primary, what it will be, secondary or tertiary?
Secondary.
This will be primary.
Because of the year.
This will be primary because if I said that if you're looking at live on a monitor and it is showing you moving lines, the bar graphs or these lines are moving, so it will be primary. If
I was looking at the years, that's why.
it could be secondary, it could also be secondary because I'm showing it to you right now and assuming these dates, don't ignore these dates.
Okay.
These dates are, say, for example, 2022 and all. If I'm showing you this and I've just taken a recent screenshot, maybe an hour back or so, and I'm showing this to you, then you are watching it on either a screen or maybe on a presentation, and this will become secondary. Is that okay? Because this is a live graph or a live bar chart, which is showing two lines which are changing simultaneously in real time. That is why it will be primary. Now, this is a book. Is it primary, secondary, or tertiary?
Television. I would say secondary.
I would say primary. I'm assuming I got it and I'm reading it for the first time as well.
So it is.
Yeah. Or theory.
So look at the words in the book.
The
Now,
history of the television. So it's
television.
been already history. It's been taken.
Yes.
Is it the tertiary then?
It will be secondary. First, whosoever said secondary. Reason, you're going to be reading this book, but you're reading this book firsthand, but you're reading about history. That means this is already published. So it is going to be secondary. Is that okay?
Yeah.
If it was about television, then it could have been primary or secondary because it did not have the word history on it. Because it is something which has already been published, discussed, created in the past and you're reading it right now, even though you're reading it firsthand because you're reading the book, it'll still be secondary because it is going to talk about something in the past. Okay, let's look at the last example, last one or two. This is a website. Is it primary, secondary?
Primary.
You get clues from the words on the, when you see the picture or a slide I'm showing, look at the clues, what it is giving you. So primary or secondary, look at the tweet.
Secondary.
Secondary.
Okay, well, that's correct. So this is secondary. Why is it secondary?
Because it's from like it's not today, it's this week, last week, and the week before, like it's past.
Either way, yes. So basically looking at the clues, which is the tweets, it is showing that this is maybe talking about a review of a particular film. And obviously people have already tweeted and I am reading them secondhand on the website, right? So in some case, if I tweet, then it'll become primary, but because I'm reading somebody else's tweet or reviews secondhand, somebody is, tweeting about it, or probably, you're not receiving this information firsthand on the website from a point of view of tweets, that is why it will be secondary. Let's look at this last one, which is newspapers. Is it primary, secondary, or tertiary?
Primary.
Primary.
Okay.
Well, it's secondary because if it's wrote
I'll
by
tell you, this is all the
somebody.
three. If I again look at the details, they're saying 30th May 2011. So this is something which is coming from an archive, and I've probably got the Daily Mail. It could be tertiary because I'm reading the newspaper that has something on it which somebody else has compiled, published. I'm reading it as a third source, so I'm tertiary. If it is a newspaper that you're picking up on that day from the newsstand, which is current for today's date, then it'll become primary. But if you again pick up the paper today, which is for 18th of November, but there is a story or a coverage on it which basically describes the missile attack or the misfired missile attack on Poland, which had happened a few days back, then in that case, that story or that reason, because that is in the past, will become secondary. So it could be, depending on how you interpret it, it could be primary, secondary, or tertiary. But basically, first part, it is secondary because I'm reading information which has already been published. And it is a second-hand source that I'm going to read this on the newspaper. So the news editor would have been primary when the news was being printed on the paper and he was reading the proof, maybe 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 a.m. in the morning, he would have been primary. But because I'm picking it up at 8 o'clock from the newsstand, it is secondary. And if I leave this for a couple of days, I bought the newspaper, I left it in the home, and I read it on the weekends, then it will become tertiary. Okay, the last one. Magazines, primary oblique secondary. If it is the magazine of the month, like for example, you buy Business Week and it is Business Week for November. If you buy that edition of November, it will be primary throughout the month because you are reading it and buying it in the current month. But if you're reading the November issue in the December month, it is, and the December issue has come out, but you're reading the November issue, then this will become secondary. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I can go on. There are a couple more slides, but essentially this should give you an idea in terms of how do we identify sources of material which are going to be either primary, secondary, or essentially, looking at tertiary in some cases. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, what we also want to do very briefly in this case is look at, some parts of it to identify what could be the theory behind this. So what I want to look at is now a bit of a theory behind this. And the theory behind this is what I'm going to talk about with regards to, why we look at primary, secondary, and tertiary research, and how do I go about doing this. So let me share a presentation wherein I would want to discuss. So this is what we are looking at is from a point of view of learning outcome 2. And learning outcome 2 essentially has 2-3 areas that we need to look at. We need to know and understand what are various forms of sources of information, primary, and how do we differentiate between primary and secondary. So the first assessment criteria talks about describe the process for carrying out primary research. Second assessment criteria talks about describe the process of how do you collect conduct secondary research. And the distinction criteria talks about analyze with example what constitutes a good primary or secondary research. So if I look at reasons of why primary research is done, primary research, as we looked at yesterday in the introduction of the unit, it is done primarily because you want to come out with collect data, you want to come out with new treatments, you want to look at solving problems and issues. And that is why we need to look at collection of data, interpretation of data. And that can be done by undertaking a systematic investigation for us to be able to uncover series of events, data, and data can then be translated into information. And information, when analyzed, gives us meaningful data which can be used for making or taking decisions. So in this case, in the context of health and social care, it is going to be useful because it is going to help us understand existing treatments, come out with new possible ways, medication, drugs, or treatments which are going to be useful for patients. And as a healthcare professional, this will allow us to, effectively deliver those treatments or, medication to patients. Now, research can be looked at from a point of view of, if you look at the COVID pandemic, a lot of data was collected with different organizations. It has been analyzed, and then it has led to the clinical trials of the COVID vaccine. At some stage, these vaccines have been approved by the WHO. And now we see these vaccines being used and given to mass population in order to overcome this pandemic or overcome this particular disease. Now, when you talk about primary versus secondary research, you have to look at a basic understanding of what are these two types. Primary tends to be when you are looking at basically getting the information firsthand, and that firsthand information would come when you're interacting with the participants, doing an interview, taking on surveys or questionnaires, which are essentially used and then collected from the person who's answering them firsthand. That means you're utilizing that data and getting hold of that data firsthand. Secondary tends to be when you are basically collecting information from articles, books, journals, newspapers, internet, published sources where you're able to find relevant and useful pieces of information. And that is useful for your own research activity. You're collating it, collecting it, and at some stage you will utilize it for relating it to your own research project that you would do. One of the other things that we also name this as is when we talk about primary, we talk about field-based research. That means you have to physically go out and start meeting the participants, speak to customers, speak to patients. Clinical trials, when they are done in not on paper. They are not done on, in the office. They are going to be done primarily when you go out and see patients and obviously, administer the vaccine and things like that. Secondary research is also called desk-based research because you're going to be sitting somewhere and collating the data or information which is already available in the published domain. Now, when we look at primary research, we need to look at the first assessment criteria, which is going to talk about what are the ways through which we can collect data firsthand. And these are the sources from which you can collect data or go about collecting data using these techniques firsthand. So interviews, surveys, questionnaires that we give out. Sometimes you go to a hotel, you stay in a holiday. When you're checking out at the reception, the hotel reception or the front office manager would give you a survey or a questionnaire. Some of them are served to you on paper and you fill out those questions and then you leave the survey back in the, you drop it back in the box. Or sometimes the person would say that you would receive an email, and I would really appreciate if you could fill that up and give us your feedback on how your stay was at the hotel. Because these are coming to you firsthand and you're using them to be able to give them information firsthand, they will all be considered as techniques through which data is collected firsthand, and they will be called primary. Now, primary research tends to take longer and more time because it is cost intensive. So if you have to print out surveys, you have to go out and meet people face to face. If the research that you're undertaking for the COVID, for example, a lot of people, were asked to come in, or doctors and GPs were asked to go to various sites, locations to be able to collect data, look at the symptoms. it was quite time consuming and it was quite expensive from a point of view of travel cost, stay cost, things like that, administrative costs, operation costs. So primary research tends to be cost intensive. When we look at secondary research, because you're looking at collecting data or collating data which is already present in the public domain on published sites or reports which have been published by government agencies, you're basically extracting the information from there. So it is less expensive and less time consuming as compared to primary research techniques. And that is why it's called secondary research. Secondary research is something that we're going to be carrying out for this unit. And the reason why I've explained that is because when you look at shortlisting a topic of your interest to write a report in task 3, it will be based on the report which you're going to download from either the Health Foundation or from the NHS website. And that report is going to be used to basically fulfill or complete some of the aspects of the research proposal. And then you're going to write the key elements of that report under 5 broad headings. Excuse me, under 5 broad headings, and they would include things like introduction, aims, objectives, literature review, what is the research methodology or the strategy. In this case, it is going to be secondary and qualitative. And then you will look at tabulating some findings from that report presented by using screenshots of graphs, tables, and then draw conclusions basically coming from that report, concluding and putting it in your own words, and then putting list of sources, which is basically the bibliography, and that will all constitute what is called secondary research. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages of doing different types of research. So these are advantages of primary research and disadvantages of primary research. So interviews, for example, you don't have control over the interview questions. These are all primary research techniques: interviews, surveys, observations, focus group, and research services. So let's discuss one just as a case example. Now, if you were looking at doing surveys and collecting data from participants directly, you would need to do things like sending out a participant information form to give them background about what is the research, how the data is going to be collected, what the data will be used for, what information could be published in the in the public domain in the future. You would need to explain all these. And when you try and collect data firsthand, you need a large sample size, because sometimes you'll have interview questionnaires or surveys coming back as incomplete, or maybe multiple choices have been done on a same question, which would basically make them unusable because they would have to be voided as the data could be skewed. Sometimes people, put extreme views in surveys, so you'll have to negate those out. And that would mean that your population size in terms of sampling that you would require would be quite large. Now, this would also be time consuming because you send out a survey by email, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, or you send it out by the post. There's a bit of time which will be required. Some people will respond maybe immediately. Some might take a few weeks or days to respond. And until all the data survey comes back, you won't be able to utilize or come out or compile a report. Example of this would be a census report. When the government does population census, it has to go and knock on every door in the country. It can't just say that, okay, I've done the census in this area, this location, and I appropriate that data and say that is the population of UK. Everybody will be canvassed, and every door will be knocked, and data will be collected on the number of people living in that household. And that is what the census would require. That is why census is probably also done once in 10 years, because it is very cost intensive, it is very time intensive, and the data has to be accurate when compiled. And that is why sometimes, these kind of activities, they are termed as time intensive. Now, if we look at the negatives of it, sometimes collecting primary data through surveys, questionnaires could be, quite cumbersome. It would be very difficult to collect data. Sometimes you are not able to get in touch with people, or sometimes you are able to get in touch with people, but they don't give you the data in the required format as it might be required. And in some cases, what you will also see sometimes is that people do not discuss or want to divulge that information because they feel that it is either encroaching on their personal information, or they do not feel disclosing that information to you publicly. So in those cases, what you will generally see is that some part of those surveys and questionnaires have to be discarded because data is not being collected completely. So there could be lots of advantages and disadvantages of primary and secondary research. And that is what I've compiled here, just to go through for your brief reading and understanding. Now, what I would want to do at some stage here is also ask you to do a little bit of additional reading. There is this one particular website, which is a site which helps you understand what is primary data and what is primary research. And I want to show you this in a second. Let me open both of them up. So this is quite a vast topic. And the reason I would want you to go in and read these two, articles or basically websites, they're about a 10-minute read, but they will tell you in terms of basic and give you some detailed idea about what we have covered, in the presentation, in a shorter or a brief format. So why is primary research done? What are the techniques of primary research? And then what are the pros and cons? And it is generally a good read for you to understand theoretically, because this learning outcome talks about understand the primary and secondary data, primary and secondary research methods. So you would need to look at reading this as an additional, I would say, for additional knowledge. And it'll be a good read if you look at reading this and the other site, which is primarily talking about why is research important in the health and social care context, in the medical context, because we are not looking at generically reading this unit. We're looking at focused on understanding research in health and social care. So this particular website, a 5-minute read, would give you an example of why research is important within health and social care. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, any questions on today's discussion in the topic? So this is a short version of the learning outcome today, because it has only 2 assessment criteria that we need to discuss. And this helps us, cover them comprehensively by understanding what are the various types of data by using the slideshow which I've shown. Now that we understand what is primary and secondary and tertiary form of data, we have looked at also how do you go about carrying primary and secondary research by using some of the techniques which are defined for carrying out primary research through surveys, questionnaires, focus group interviews, and secondary research primarily through the purposes of looking at data which has been collated from government reports, articles, journals published on websites, either in print or on electronic format. So any questions?
I have only one question. Is about the assignment.
Yeah.
All this assignment from 1 and 2, is it have to be on a PowerPoint or is it on a Word document?
No, as I mentioned to you yesterday, on this particular unit, you will have about 4 or 5 templates that we will provide. Most of the assignments, apart from this particular learning outcome, which is learning outcome 2, is going to be done through the point of view of templates. So this is going to be a Word document. I don't think there is any PowerPoint presentation in this particular unit. You will be required to primarily create a Word document. So for learning outcome 1 and learning outcome 6, there are 2 templates, PDP. For learning outcome 3, 4, and 5, there are again templates which are provided, which is the research title and note taking that we are going to discuss next week. And they would be completing the templates to be able to complete the assignment.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
Yes.
No worries. So a copy of this presentation is going to be on the Moodle. And then obviously the 2 sites that I've shown are already here. So they are clickable links. You should be able to see that. And I've sent you the templates for learning outcome 1. There is no template for learning outcome 2. So this is something which we will discuss when we do the assignment. It is going to be a short Word document that you will create, because it will theoretically ask you to discuss what are primary and secondary research methods, and that will come across from these slides that you will write in your own words. Okay, no worries. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.
I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
On
Thank you very much.
Thursday and Friday, same time.
On
Thank you.
Thursday and Friday. Yep. Thank you very much.
you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.